Hello and welcome to another view from Mayor Brown. This sits alongside our regular podcast and is an occasional series of interviews with those involved in the changes going on in employment law. The podcast is presented by Nicholas Robertson, the head of Mayor Brown's London employment team. At the end of the podcast, we will explain how to get in touch if you have any comments or questions.
Hello and welcome to a special podcast, a guest podcast in our ongoing series, Another View from Mayor Brown. I am delighted to be joined today by Helen, Ruelle and Jessica Roland from Mourant, Ozannes. The first question I'm going to ask them is to say a little bit about the department and the work that they do, but to spare their blushes, I will simply say that Jessica is head of the practice in Guernsey, managing partner in Guernsey, and it has stellar feedback in the employment directories, and Helen is head of the employment practice in Jersey and has equally stellar employment practice. And I'm not going to ask them to work out who's got the best feedback, because that's probably not the way to do things. But starting at the beginning, do you want to tell me just a little bit about Mourant Ozannes and the work that you do, so to explain the background to the podcast and then the questions we're going to be discussing?
Absolutely. So we are a full range. We do the full range of employment work, contentious and non-contentious in both islands. We also have a practice in Cayman. So Hector Robinson, our partner, heads up our Cayman offering. We're the largest team in the Channel Islands, certainly when it comes to employment work. That in UK terms would be a small team, but actually for the Channel Islands it's a large team. And as I say, we do the full range of work, and equally we do our own advocacy in relation to our contentious work. So when work comes to the team, it stays within the team right from the beginning through to tribunal and court work.
Interesting. Jessica, would you like to add?
Just to say, I think we are the only Pan-Island team that is Tier 1 in both islands and across the Channel Islands, and I think we're the only one that's partner-led as well, and certainly that's something that our clients appreciate.
Well, certainly the feedback on the website that I saw is very, very favourable, and I think most of us would kill to have equivalent feedback. So my congratulations on that.
We're fishing in a small pond, to be fair.
Yeah, but you want to take good feedback wherever it comes. Trust me. So we're talking today about employment law in the Channel Islands, and the big theme being, what would surprise employers who are predominantly based outside the Channel Islands but have employees in the Channel Islands. What would surprise them about employment law in the Channel Islands? But I'm going to start by asking what's possibly a really crass question, which is the status of the Channel Islands in or out of the UK. The UK may be debating in and out of Europe, but the Channel Islands in or out of the UK?
Out, and generally out of everything. So
right.
Out of the UK and out of the EU. So
Right.
None of our legislation comes from either the UK, particularly in the employment field, from either the UK or from Europe. So some of our legislation may look like some of the legislation you will be familiar with in the UK or indeed from Europe, but we have no obligation to enact any of the European legislation at all.
So you've got a sort of UKIP model of
Yes.
Paris thought. That's probably not appropriate.
Yeah. So we have our own legislature, our own
Yes.
courts, our own tax systems, everything. So our own states assembly. So we decide in both islands what legislation we enact and how that is then implemented through the courts.
So the common assumption that lawyers will make, or most of us will make, is that there was a common bedrock of laws throughout Europe, stretching from Ireland through to Russia, whatever, the borders of Russia. It's just wrong in relation to Channel Islands. You can't make that. You can't make that assumption.
No, absolutely not.
Right.
And even the law that we have, which might look familiar, may very well be interpreted quite differently,
Yes.
because the basis of our laws is ancient Normandy French law, not English law. So particularly in things like contract law, our courts will look first to old French law rather than English law. that has changed, and there's a big debate in both islands about whether that's right or wrong, whether we should be moving more to an English law model. But our contract law, for example, is entirely different.
Fascinating. I had no idea, no idea at all. Well, let's just follow that theme then. So, in terms of the differences between Jersey and Guernsey employment law compared to England and Wales, I'm sure there are, masses and masses and masses. But what would you say are the key ones, or the ones that seem to cause most surprise to employers when they encounter them for the first time, or employment lawyers? Okay.
I suppose the first thing to always remember is, of course, that Guernsey and Jersey are entirely separate. We're as separate from each other as we are from England and from France. So there's often an assumption that there is some sort of Channel Island law. It's not the case. We're both fiercely independent of one another.
You're speaking to a Scotsman. I can relate to the British law question where I'm going, no, there's English or there's Scots.
Indeed. And in fact, if you really want to go to the granular detail of the Channel Islands, Alderney and Sark are separate, although they're part of the bailiwick of Guernsey. In terms of employment law, Sark has its own course, which is actually not to have any employment law, and likewise Sark is separate again, doesn't have any employment law, but may have contractual differences from Guernsey. So it's really important to not think of the Channel Islands as an amorphous lump.
And I thought I was getting a handle on all this. Oh dear. Oh dear. Okay, well, we'll have to work out some way of generalising, otherwise we're going to have to have 4 answers to every question at this rate. Who wants to go with the key differences?
Shall I start? So, I mean, a lot of our law is very similar. So we would have, for example, basic premises like unfair dismissal, very similar to the UK. Things around Jersey, we have, for example, statutory redundancy, both collective consultation and redundancy pay, which is similar to but slightly different from in terms of numbers to the UK. We don't have things like the Working Time Directive. We don't have TUPE, which is actually a problem. You'll probably, as an employment lawyer, you'd probably be surprised that I say that. But actually, I think we find not having an equivalent of TUPE is actually quite difficult at times, because we have to recreate it. Very often in, for example, M&A transactions where we're trying to move people from one entity to another, we don't have any statutory mechanism by which that happens.
So the business needs then mean you get driven to recreate it.
Yes.
Because I know the thing about TUPE when it was introduced into the UK at the very last minute by the Conservative government. They did so because they had to, and the statement to Parliament was, "We do this with a remarkable lack of enthusiasm," and that was sort of shown in the slipshod way it got implemented. And as a result, lawyers have been making money out of TUPE forever and ever and ever.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting that market pressures actually mean that TUPE is now seen as desirable. You end up recreating it in some cases.
Well, certainly, because often the Channel Island piece is a small part of a large transaction. If there's some sort of global transaction, and everybody's sort of got their head around TUPE and they understand what's going on, and then there's this sort of actually they don't do that in Guernsey and Jersey. Actually, we've got an issue where potentially we've got redundancy issues and we've got terminations, and these people aren't just going to jump from one to the other, and they've got the right to say, do you know what, I'm not happy about that, and they're never the people you don't want, they're always the people you do want. So we try and find creative ways, and thus far they've always worked, but we're always doing this in a world where actually it hasn't been tested by the court. No employee has just stood up and say, well, I don't accept you could do this, or the basis upon which you were doing this. So it does create just an interest.
And very often, because of the pool of labour in the Channel Islands is relatively small, a purchaser, for example, is very often keen to take people from a business that they're buying, because without those people, very often the business can be virtually worthless. They need those skilled people to come with the business.
And if there are collective redundancy consultation obligations in Jersey, does that then mean that sometimes you're trying to deal with what is a redundancy situation without actually getting dragged through consultation?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Yeah, so we do try to say without in any way terminating employment, get people across, which is a challenge.
So Helen, I'm going to follow Jersey to differences in Jersey, and I'm going to come back to Jessica in terms of the Guernsey differences.
Absolutely.
So follow through. So unfair dismissal, yes. Statutory redundancy, yes. Maybe quirks. No working time. No TUPE.
No TUPE. We do have discrimination law, but that's a new thing in Jersey, very new. So we've only had anti-discrimination legislation for just coming up 12 months.
Gosh.
Yeah, which is a huge
Sweet,
difference.
If I didn't know better and see the gritted teeth, I'd think that was.
Exactly.
I won't ask you on file what that's like. But so 12 months, and is that sex race? I mean, is it
No. So we only have at the moment the only protected characteristic in Jersey law is race at the moment. From the 1st of September this year, we will be adding sex, sexual orientation, gender reassignment, and pregnancy and childbirth as protected characteristics. But they are, as I say, we're very, in comparison to the UK, and this is one thing that really does make people's jaw drop, frankly, particularly onshore lawyers who phone up very regularly and say, can we just check something through with you? We've got this claim and we think we might have a discrimination problem. Until the 1st of September last year, the answer was you can't have a discrimination problem in Jersey unless it also is an unfair dismissal or a constructive unfair dismissal or a contractual claim. So it's a huge difference.
And that's yes, I was going to say, and it's interesting to compare that with the rest of Europe, where of course these are sort of enshrined truths now. And yes, there are some grumbling around the edges, but it's sort of fundamental principle. Okay.
And similarly, surprisingly, the 1st of September this year will be the first time that the island has had any protection for what I would sort of term family-friendly rights. So no maternity, no paternity. Nothing, no flexible working, no adoption, nothing.
So here's the question: you both qualified as lawyers in England,
yes,
and you elected to move to these islands to carry on business there with no possibility of any family.
Yes.
Well, I didn't have a choice. You see, I'm from Guernsey. I just,
you just had to go. You're back there, right? Okay, fine.
And bizarrely, I came to practice in Jersey into employment work because I was a commercial and corporate lawyer by background and had done some TUPE work, and because I'd done that when I got to Jersey at the time 15 years ago, nobody had ever done any employment work because there wasn't any law, and then it started to come in and people said you know something about this stuff, don't you? And my sort of corporate and commercial practices got smaller and the employment practices got bigger over the years. So those are, I would say, are probably the main changes, the ones that we find most fascinating. People are most fascinated by. They just can't really.
Yes, it would be a sort of a head spinner.
Absolutely.
To what extent is Guernsey different then from Jersey in terms of the things that stand out?
We don't have statutory redundancy.
Right.
In fact, the only provision we have redundancy is a fair process. And so if the process is wrong, you've got an unfair dismissal claim, but there's no redundancy claim save unless you have contractual redundancy pay, which is quite common, to be fair, certainly in the finance sector anyway. We've had sex discrimination in since 2005, so we're quite go ahead.
Radical.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
But that is the only discrimination law we have in, and probably next on the statute books will be disability discrimination, because that's the principle's been passed in the legislature, our states of Guernsey, and it's in the process of being drafted at the moment.
Fascinating.
But actually, just going back to the TUPE question, so we don't have TUPE either, but actually one of the problems which Helen identified, which is very true, is that pool of workers is so limited. And part of that problem is because one of the striking differences we have in both Channel Islands is we have limitations on your ability to work over there.
I was going to ask about that. Yes, and so you can't just bring people in to make up labour shortages,
and you can't find clever secondment ways or great planning ways. The rules are very strict. You cannot have people who do not have the correct licences or status declarations working in the Channel Islands. And they're different from each island, and your ability to achieve these licences are different in each island. So you need to, if you're coming into business in Guernsey or Jersey, you need to come in advisedly and slowly, and not expect to be able to say, it's Jersey tomorrow, and think you can start work the next day. Yeah. And I think
sounds like conversations you've had many times in your career. What do you mean? I can't.
It is I would say that is probably the biggest difference. Very often when we're working with people who may, for example, have come to your firm first and they say, we need some Jersey or Guernsey advice, the first question is often, how do we bring our business to the Channel Islands? We want to ship somebody over next week. that is just not going to happen.
What's the sort of time period? I mean, I appreciate it'll depend on lots and lots of factors, but if you were saying, on average, you should assume it's not going to be less than, weeks, months, whatever.
I'd say about 3 months minimum.
3 months, right.
I mean, I can't work in Jersey, and Helen couldn't work in Guernsey, so that you don't get any dibs for being even I, who am a Channel Islander from my birth.
So if you inadvertently answer a question on Jersey, something bad happens
Yes,
through this
that's it,
podcast,
yes,
you'll be taken out.
Exactly. It wouldn't probably be quite so long in Jersey, but that would depend to a large extent on the nature of the business. So it could very well be a longer period if you also needed, for example, financial services regulatory permissions. If those are required as well, the whole process may well get a bit longer. But we would hope every business in Jersey has to have what's called a business license. It is a requirement. Doesn't matter what the nature of your business is, you have to have one to operate in Jersey. It's a criminal offence not to have one, which always makes people think twice about making sure they've got one before they embark on something in Jersey. And that license, actually, the last thing we would want to do is put people off. You can get them, but you just have to go through the hoops and allow the time for that to happen. And it's something we do an awful lot of. So it's very much a part of both of our practices.
Helping businesses through that process to get here. Okay.
And the people so in addition to that in Jersey, you would also need special licenses for any individual who is not locally qualified, and I say that with inverted commas and shorthand.
Yes.
And I don't mean sort of academic qualifications. I mean residential qualifications. And again, those things can become. They are quite difficult sometimes to get, depending on the type of person and what it is that person is going to be doing. Basically, they have to be essentially employed. And you have to show that you can't employ somebody from Jersey or who is already in Jersey to do that work.
Interesting, very interesting. In terms of, I'm getting the impression that there's a number of idiosyncrasies and quirks in terms of doing business in Jersey and Guernsey. Again, just following that theme, what else would you highlight and say, look, if you're thinking of doing business in each island, what would strike a UK-based employer, let's say, as being noticeably different from UK practice?
I think for Jersey, it is most definitely the business licensing regime, without a doubt. All of the other things will be familiar, but you just need to realise that they could very well be slightly different. So I would say that's certainly the biggest difference.
I think that's probably true. For us, it's the right to work, and as an employer, if you employed somebody who didn't have the proper record, again, that's a criminal liability, and it can be a director level liability. So
you get people's attention.
Yes,
absolutely.
People aren't being shipped off to prison on a regular basis, but nevertheless, it does concentrate the mind in terms of people's ability to work. And there's sort of interesting quirk. So anybody can buy a house, but your right to live in the house is controlled by this right to work, and in turn, it's that document which you rely on to show you can actually work in Guernsey as well. So it's sort of
it's a circle.
Yes, and it's not necessarily completely logical, but it is the way it is, I suppose.
And I think that, as Jessica was saying, that the other sort of quirk is around that. People often say, well, we won't come to Jersey, we'll just fly people in every so often to do work. No, you can't do that either. There are certain exemptions which are quite complicated, but there is an ability to have people in the island for relatively short periods of time without requiring full licensing. But again, there isn't really a way around this stuff, and we often go through these conversations. Well, if we do it this way, that'll mean we don't need a license. No, unfortunately not. So I would say it's really that,
yes.
And it's very hard sometimes, I find, to focus people's attention on that. What they will often be very focused on is, can you look at our contracts and make sure they work from a Jersey and a Guernsey perspective? Can you advise us on, how we might enter into a lease to get premises? And we have to keep saying, no, hang on a minute. That's further. Exactly. Let's focus on this. We can do all of that. Absolutely, it can all be done. But let's focus on that. So I would say to people,
Start at the beginning.
At the beginning. Plan.
Yes. Plan. Yes.
Yeah.
Plan.
Absolutely.
Allow time.
Yeah.
Okay. Fascinating. Well, what about the enforcement process for employment rights in Jersey and Guernsey? Are there separate specialist employment courts? How does it work?
We
Maybe the islands are different.
Yes, they are. We have a tribunal system, which is 3 lay members, which means although they are all mostly well-respected HR members or senior union representatives, then none of them are lawyers. Well, one's legally trained. Okay, that's a demonstration. We actually know each of the tribunal members, so we can identify who has a law degree. But nevertheless, they're not lawyers, and that does mean that sometimes it can be a little bit of a ride in terms of what the result may be. It makes it very exciting, but it does make it more unpredictable. And they will deal with any unfair dismissal matter or any sex discrimination matter, but they have no jurisdiction in terms of breach of contract. That has to go to the courts. If it's under 10,000, our magistrates court; over 10,000, our royal court. And in terms of rights of audience, anybody can appear in the tribunal, but in terms of the Royal Court of Guernsey, only Guernsey advocates can appear.
Okay.
So that would mean, for example, that I can't appear in the Guernsey courts. I could appear in the Guernsey tribunal, but not in the Guernsey courts.
Okay, right.
So Jersey is very similar. We have our own tribunal as well, but our tribunal is chaired by a legally qualified chairman or deputy chairman. So we have a number of senior advocates who would sit as deputy chair, for example, or chairman. And so our judgments tend to be more legally focused,
yes,
I would say. There's that you will often see quite an in-depth, and I think it's becoming more so actually in Jersey. You would see a much more in-depth analysis of the legal issues in a claim before the tribunal than perhaps you would in Guernsey. Our right of appeal from our tribunal, so our tribunal can hear unfair dismissal, anything basically arising under the employment law. It can also hear breach of contract claims, but only up to a maximum of £10,000.
Right.
Over that, you would have to go to the Royal Court. They will not hear, our tribunal won't hear personal injury claims in relation to restrictive covenants. All of those would have to go.
Similar sort of division.
All of those would have to go to the Royal Court. Our Royal Court is also the court of appeal from the tribunal, so we don't have an appeal tribunal, absolutely, and that's on a point of law. Our court is like the Guernsey court. The Royal Court is our court of first instance, and you can only appear in that court if you are a Jersey advocate.
No Guernsey advocates there.
No
Thank you very much.
Advocates allowed. Absolutely not.
And actually, there's only one. This is an interesting piece of trivia. There's only one advocate I'm aware of that is both Jersey and Guernsey qualified.
Oh, who is that?
A chap called Thomas Mallin.
Oh, there you go.
There you go. We all learn something today. That's a trivia. That's a Trivial Pursuit question. In spades. Yeah, that's brilliant. Sorry, geek question. You were talking about French. The decisions sort of being sort of French law approach rather than English common law. Does that mean that there's less precedent involved?
Precedent's a really interesting thing in the court. The tribunal will very much look to its own sort of decisions first. Interesting, and that's quite different. But certainly in the Royal Court, our Royal Court is not bound by English precedent at all, but it is persuasive, certainly in areas like employment law, where the statutes, for example, are in some respects virtually identical, but you would be expected first of all to rely upon Jersey
and precedent. There is a system of precedent in Jersey, because my very limited understanding of French civil law is that precedent is much less important.
We're sort of an amalgam of the two.
Right.
And the French law that influences Jersey law is pre-Code Civil. Yeah.
Right.
So so actually Code Civil precedent it has limited value in Jersey and Guernsey, although sometimes it is called upon. Equally, we might look at other Commonwealth jurisdictions as well sometimes. So you do see, for example, Australian or New Zealand cases quoted. Scottish law actually is a lot more similar to Jersey law than English law is. So again, you would see some of it's at times when there is no Jersey precedent, and so it goes sort of along the pecking order.
Yes, interesting.
An example actually where Code Civil might be quite useful is we have in Guernsey, and I think you do in Jersey, a principle of guardianship rather than a court of protection. We have people being appointed as guardians, and you can sort of follow the thread of where that came from through Norman law into modern French law. And actually, quite recently, I was involved in a case where we were actually looking directly at the Code Civil and using that as the influence in terms of the development of Guernsey law in that area. So, it's amazing how relatively frequently we are looking
all the way back.
We're looking right as opposed to up.
A long way back. Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Fascinating. What about tax? Let's talk about tax. PAY. No, let's not talk about tax. No, on the basis that it's a subject close to every employee's hearts. How does the tax system compare and contrast in Guernsey and Jersey?
Well, we have a system that's very similar to PAYE.
Right.
It's called an ET1, but it's basically the same sort of thing. So an employee will have, tax deducted by the employer, who in turn will pay it to the income tax authority. Just on the tax point, our tax is a flat 20%, although you'll get deductions. So you'll have a personal deduction, and you'll have other reasons why it might be less than 20, but that's
20% across the board.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
And similarly in Jersey, we haven't had our PAYE equivalent is called ITIS, and it is deducted as well at source on a monthly basis according to your effective rate, which you are notified of by the tax authority. But that is a relatively new thing in Jersey. Yeah, absolutely. It's probably only been the last 3 or 4 years. It might not even be that long. Previously, every employee had to do their own tax return. Nobody deducted tax. You were paid gross, and it was your responsibility as an employee to account to the tax authorities for that.
We still have to do an annual tax return, do you?
Yes.
Yeah.
You do, yes. You still have to do an annual tax return, but if your only income is your salary,
then it's
then
a short process.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And we also have an equivalent of national insurance,
Right.
so social security, which is deducted at 6 and 6.5%.
Is that employer, and is that an employer, and the equivalent employer's national insurance?
Absolutely. So there's an employer, and then the employee has a deduction as well up to it. There's a ceiling over which you don't pay. Yeah.
Fascinating. Yeah. Okay, let's take a step back and say, if you were saying to a hypothetical international employer, look, these are the key things you really need to know, the key tips for international employers. What would you say in terms of, take Guernsey first? What would be the first things that would come to mind?
Remember, it's an independent jurisdiction, so we're not part of the UK, we're not part of the EU, so we paddle our own canoe. Things will look and sound similar, but they will be a little different. So it's terribly important that you find out first,
yes,
rather than falling foul of the situation. But it will be similar enough to a European world that it won't be frightening. It'll just simply be just need to be cognizant that it is a separate jurisdiction in the same way any other.
So it'll be explicable, but don't charge in there thinking, I know how this works.
Yeah.
How difficult can this be?
And they're a pipsqueak little island. How ridiculous they've got their own law.
I doubt if anyone would make that mistake. But
I would say that is most definitely the top tip. I think you come to Jersey in the same way that you would come to any other foreign jurisdiction.
Sure.
Very much with the planning. Don't leave it too late. Go into Jersey or Guernsey in the same way as you would go into an entirely different country, and you will then be fine. Assume that, generally speaking, everything will be slightly different, and it is. Things like the data protection law and the health and safety laws, they're there, but they're slightly different, and you do things slightly differently.
yes.
So as I say, it won't be quite so different as if you were going to, I don't know, a jurisdiction that is entirely different, so a non-European jurisdiction, say, but be prepared for quirks around even the things that you're familiar with.
Okay, sounds like good advice. Well, thank you. Now, I always make a habit of asking an outside work question, because we cannot allow people to think that all we are lawyers and that we do nothing but legal work. So I offered you a books or music choice, and you've both gone for the books choice. So who wants to go first? Let's do this. Tell me, book you're reading at the moment for pleasure. You're not allowed to give me a work-related book. So
I was going to Gordon Dawes, Dawes on Guernsey.
then you'll be drummed out of this podcast forthwith.
Absolutely.
So Go on, Jessica. Tell us what you're reading at the moment.
Well, actually, I'm reading a Martin Amis book, but unfortunately I can't remember its name. It's got the word zone in the title.
All right, well, I can't help with that, I'm afraid.
But what I've just finished is
All right.
the P.D. James Death in Pemberley, which I have to say I was a bit disappointed with.
Oh, really?
Mm.
All right. Have you read a lot of P.D. James?
I like P.D. James,
yes.
and I love Pride and Prejudice, but I just didn't think it worked.
Ah, yes, I remember seeing some reviews that saying. Whereas
Mm.
I detest Pride and Prejudice, and I detest everything to do with Jane Austen. Oh, controversial. No. That's a subject for a long discussion. Off mic, definitely.
Absolutely.
God, sacrilege, yes. So,
And I am very much keying up for the summer reading. I'm afraid I don't do literary
Right.
works when I'm outside of work. So I'm reading a book called The Little Paris Bookshop. I don't know if you've
No, I
heard
don't
of
know
that
this
by
at all.
Nina George, and it's actually a really lovely read.
Right.
It is not taxing,
I'm all in
and
favour of that.
it is a bit of a, I would say, what the equivalent of a chick flick,
Right.
that sort of a book. But I would definitely recommend it for summer reading. I'm off to the south of France for my holidays, and it's really putting me in the mood.
Put in the mood.
Absolutely.
Excellent. Well, Helen, Jessica, thank you so much indeed. That's been
Absolute
really interesting.
pleasure.
I've
Thank
learned a
you.
load. It sounds like you've learned some bits as well in the
Absolutely.
process of this. So that's good.
It's
good.
great.
So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So, that concludes this podcast. We hope that you find it and others in this special Another View series helpful. If you have any comments or questions, please email Nick at nrobertson@mayorbrown.com. This podcast is an overview of the cases and law, and how the law will apply in any particular case will depend on the individual circumstances. Listeners should seek legal advice if any of the matters discussed are relevant to a specific issue or concern. Thanks for listening.